Thank you everyone for attending Forbidden Knowledge, a book talk with Hannah Marcus. And thank you, Hannah, for being here. We're celebrating Banned Books Week, talking about some really important stuff. So we have Hannah, who's here with us. They're an associate professor of social sciences in the Department of History and Science at Harvard University, and also an interim director of the collection of historical scientific instruments at Harvard. A lot of Hannah's research focuses on scientific culture of early modern Europe. So we're really happy to have you here. And we have Ty, who is our special collections and rare books librarian, who works in our historical medical library. We're going to talk about some books today. So I might just hand it over to y'all. And let's get started.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to get to be here, and so lovely to be in conversation with Ty about the collections at the Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia in relation to my own work on censorship, ecclesiastical censorship in particular, the Catholic censorship of medical and scientific books. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that tonight. And I just want to begin by acknowledging that this is Banned Books Week. And when we talk about Banned Books Week, my enthusiasm about banned books really comes out of studying the history of censorship, but this isn't something that's over either. Censorship is very much part of our society today. Book banning is at an all-time high in this country. Requests and petitions for book bans, government's responses, local librarians are often caught in the middle of that. And so I just think it's important for us to think in historical perspective about the events that are happening today as well. I want to invite you all to take a look at my book, Forbidden Knowledge, and I'm going to dive sort of into the book and tell you about some of the rich detail in it to give you a sense of some of the books themselves that are censored and how we can understand them as objects and how we can understand their histories. But I want to draw your attention just to the cover for a moment, because although it looks like modern art, this is actually a censored copy of a book. It's known as the Red Cyprian, with commentary by Erasmus. It's held at Johns Hopkins University. And I just one of the ways that I came to this research was that I encountered censored books at the libraries of the University of Pennsylvania when I was an undergraduate there. And I was just absolutely arrested by these objects, by the stories that it was clear that they contained. And so I went on to graduate school to study, to get my PhD. And this is something that I remained absolutely fascinated by, how we think about the control of knowledge in a period when, this is during the scientific revolution. This is a period when science and medicine are changing a huge amount. It's in the wake of the Reformation, during the Catholic Counter-Reformation. These are enormous changes in what it means to know and to be able to understand the world around you, using the different forms for doing so. So when I think about that, I want to invite you to join me in thinking about medical practice, which is often told as the story. This is a picture here on the left of Andreas Vesalius, right? In his On the Fabric of the Human Body. And he is provocatively staring out at us as he pulls down, revealing the tendons of the hand in front of him. He is showing you that he does anatomy. He is studying medicine from doing dissections on human bodies, that his knowledge is coming from engagement with the body itself. And that's something that we've often taken sort of at face value, that this is a immediate revolutionary and fundamental change in how people approached the study of medicine in the 16th century from Vesalius onward. I paired this portrait with a portrait on the right of Girolamo Mercuriale, who's a physician of sort of the generation following Vesalius, who instead of presenting himself with the human body, is presenting himself with a copy, clearly in imitation of Vesalius's portrait here, is presenting himself with a copy of Vesalius's own book. Mercuriale is one of the most famous physicians of his time. Being a famous professor of medicine in the generation following Vesalius doesn't mean exclusively turning to the body. It means turning to books. And so I want us to take seriously the bookish nature of medicine, the ways that people who were doing cutting-edge science, cutting-edge medical research in the 16th and 17th centuries understood books as an absolutely critical part of that process. And doing so entailed using books that were banned. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. Well, I'm going to talk to you a lot about that, but let me give you a little bit of context on it. So I want to give you a sense of Catholic censorship and the landscape of Catholic censorship circa 1559, when the first papal index of prohibited books was published. There were several indexes of prohibited books at different times and places. In 1559, the Pope joins the fray and is like, here's the new index. And one of the things you need to realize is that when the Pope publishes an index of prohibited books, this is not like a secret list of all the things that we might not be able to know that are hidden from view. This is a list saying explicitly what it is that people can and can't know, and sometimes even why. And this is a list that's then nailed to the doors of churches. It's read aloud on pulpits, from pulpits. This is what it means to publish the index. This is not censorship that is secret in the ways that we often think of censorship today. Additionally, I want to argue today that censorship is not exclusively about ideas. It is about ideas, but it is also about the nature and qualifications of the person speaking. And so the people that I'm going to talk about, many of the physicians that I'm talking about today, are banned not because of the nature of the medicine that they write about. This is Leonhard Fuchs. He's Lutheran physician from Germany, and you can see his face is crossed out, his name is obscured. This copy of his book is censored. And that's not because his work on plants is problematic. In fact, censors don't think it's problematic, and that's why it's allowed to circulate in this form. But he is problematic because he was Lutheran. And so a number of these people are banned because of who they are as a speaker. And that's something I want us to think with today, not about the content of the ideas, which is different, distinct from the story about, say, Galileo and heliocentrism. Additionally, I want to argue that censorship does not make texts entirely unavailable. That is, that this is not a black and white world of things that are allowed or that are burned to a crisp and no longer available for people. So censorship, if we're going to really understand censorship, I think that we need to understand the ways that things are selectively changed, that is to say expurgated, and that's the technical term, that expurgation as a form of censorship, but also understand the licensing apparatus that goes into maintaining the circulation of censored books in Catholic Italy. So whereas this is the story of the relationship between science and censorship has so often been told as this Galilean struggle between science and faith, right? With the Catholic Church putting a lid on Galileo, putting him under house arrest, banning his book for several hundred years. That all happened, but it's not the only story of censorship that's happening in this time. And if we think about the censorship of medicine and take the case study of the censorship of medical books in the 16th and 17th centuries in Italy, we end up with a very different tale. And that's a story that I would argue in which the Catholic Church tries to take these realms of forbidden knowledge, which we have on the left here, and Catholic knowledge, and bring them together to encompass this sort of counterintuitive realm of knowledge that is both forbidden and allowable to certain Catholic readers. And that's what I want to dig into for you today. So what does it take to censor books? At first, I'm going to need you to realize that I'm talking about medical books in particular. So different classes of books are treated differently. Religious books, you want to read Martin Luther? No way, not happening. Machiavelli? Probably not, too hot. But there are tons of other books that are prohibited because they're published in forbidden places, because they're written by non-Catholic authors, because they make fun of priests. And those books get expurgated, selectively expurgated. So in order to do that, that requires a lot of labor, both intellectual labor and physical labor. The intellectual labor part involves people getting copies of the books, reading them, and deciding what parts get to stay that are not problematic and what parts need to go. And so congregations of the Index of Prohibited Books were formed around Italy in the 1590s, and those were tied to very specific areas of what were considered to be local expertise. So while there's certainly censorship happening at the heart of the Catholic Church in Rome, there are also congregations of the Index that are censoring different kinds of books. So medicine and philosophy are censored in Padua, Naples, and Pisa. Astrological texts were being censored in Venice, history books in Milan, books on dueling were expurgated in Parma, Piacenza, and Cremona, this sort of violent triangle in the Po River Valley. Books on law were censored, expurgated at the University of Bologna, canon law, and at Perugia for civil law, again, thinking about the expertise of university scholars in these different places. The Catholic Church attempts to have specialists in Florence expurgate Italian literature. And like, spoiler alert, doesn't go well. Florentines are not interested in like crossing the dirty parts out of their copies of Boccaccio. They're like, that's basically the point. So this creates all sorts of conflict. Not always, but often. And so one of the things that I've taken the time to do is to go and study how we end up with a Catholic index of expurgations. That is a list not of books that are prohibited in their entirety, but of books that are prohibited until you have, the Catholic word is corrected, until you have corrected them to comply with the standards of the index. So I worked backwards, essentially, from the 1607, shown here, published copy of the Expurgatory Index. And I've gone and traced censors' papers. And so these are the papers of Girolamo Rossi. He's actually a physician who lived and worked in Ravenna. Whereas at the University of Padua, professors had been asked to censor medical books. Like in Florence, they mostly didn't want to do that work. By contrast, Girolamo Rossi, whose work we see here, whose manuscripts we see here, was having his own little personal counter-reformation. He's going through and reading these texts carefully, showing page number, you can see page number 133, top left, where it says this, cross out this, and then he explains why. He then sends those into Rome, where authorities in Rome make the ultimate decision on which parts stay and which parts go. Now, if this seems to you like a time-consuming, inefficient, and a process that could be riddled with problems, people in the 16th and early 17th century thought so too. Censors right back, they're like, why would I spend all this time doing this work? Why would I do that when I know that somebody else is working on the same book and they're going to read it differently? People understood that reading was a fundamentally interpretive process, even in the early modern period. And I think that the case of Girolamo Rossi gives an example of a true believer, somebody who really thought that this was the important and right way to go in order to make banned books then available. So I want to raise just a couple of issues at stake in medical books so that you can understand, again, some of the things that have to be taken out. So one thing that gets taken out of medical books in the 16th and 17th century are medieval disputes about magic and astrology. So things that bordered on problematic and heterodox are all of a sudden more dangerous following in the wake of the Reformation. And that's true of these sort of classic medieval disputes about magic and astrology. Additionally, there's this project to try to transform works by these best-selling Italian authors. So someone like Girolamo Cardano, who's having all sorts of encounters with demons and other heretical authors, but is also writing books that are absolute bestsellers. People want these books in Italy. They're writing to their censors, like, we need copies of these books. And so there's this effort to try to make, the hometown heroes, the Italians who have written things that were not all orthodox, to transform those books into texts that could circulate. Another issue is to remove Lutheranism from humanist physicians. And I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of this later, including a number of examples that Ty and their colleagues found for me in the libraries at the College of Physicians. But basically, that is removing the trappings of Lutheranism, like, dedicatory letters that preceded the book. So again, this is not about the medical text. This is about the framing of the book that suddenly got a Lutheran author's name and a dedication to a Lutheran prince. That's a problem. That framing needs to go. And finally, I think that there's an effort to clarify the relationship between medicine and religion in this period. And I think that that's something that physicians are interested in doing as well. And they're using the processes of book expurgation, book licensing, but censorship in general, to promote their own professional identity. That is, that physicians, are uniquely in need of prohibited books in order to do their work well. Lawyers will say the same thing, but especially physicians echo this over and over about the utility of prohibited books and the utility of their profession to Catholic society. So that's something that's coming up again and again, both from censors and from physicians, sometimes who, in the case of Girolamo Rossi, for example, are one and the same. So then, once you have a set of expurgations and an index of expurgations that one can look up the book that they have, look up the title, see which parts need to be corrected, expurgated, censored, see what parts need to be censored, and then one can go ahead and X those parts out themselves. Again, I'm going to give you a lot of examples of that in a second, but in order to keep the book legally, people still needed to have licenses to do so. So one of the things that my research in the Vatican, especially in the Inquisition archives, has shown extensively is that, we understood that there were a few reading licenses out there. This is a copy on the left of like an actual reading license. Not many of these exist. These are ephemeral, largely, right? These have largely disappeared. There's maybe a half dozen of these that I've seen. Then there's, I've seen a few hundred books that have inscriptions saying that this person is allowed to read. You can see the one here, this guy from Imola who's allowed, the Inquisitor of Padua has allowed him to read this book by Leonhard Fuchs. So that's another form of a reading license. But what I found in the archives of the Congregation of the Index of Prohibited Books were many thousands of records of people, physicians writing in, seeking licenses. So instead of looking at the pieces of paper that arrived in people's hands, the actual driver's licenses themselves, I essentially went to the Department of Transportation and got the records for people petitioning for them. And so I've been able to track some trends in how people are petitioning for different kinds of books at different times. Creates a readership history that we hadn't understood fully before. So then if you had a license to read this prohibited book, and I mean, like, I'm emphasizing the level of bureaucracy here because that's absolutely a part of this process. And I want to make an argument about the sinister effects of this kind of censorship that makes something allowed, but that require all of these hurdles in order to get there. Once you had a license to read a prohibited book and you had the book itself, then one was obligated to correct, right, to censor the book, to expurgate the book in compliance with the Index of Expurgations. And so you see that in a lot of different ways, but that indicate for me that this is a process that people were thinking about and reflecting on. This wasn't sort of automated. This is not your computer censoring something for you. This is somebody going by hand, maybe even you, the owner of the book, going by hand and enacting that. And as a result, we see huge variation. So this copy, for example, this is Erastus's Disputations, and in it, and Erastus is prohibited for a number of his views about the church, but he's writing about medicine here. So the text, again, isn't a problem. It's just Erastus's name that has to be removed. And it's printed, unfortunately, on the verso, on the backside of every single page of the book. It's one of those ones that my book doesn't have that. My book has chapter 5 at the top instead of my name. But if my name were prohibited, then you'd have to go through and cross off the name at the top. But interestingly, this copy, which is hundreds of folios long, has the name Erasti crossed off. But then when the printer made a mistake and printed not Erasti Disputat, but Disputat, that's not crossed out. There's no slip even. There's no rote aspect of this process. This is a process that people are thinking about as they go about it. And additionally, it's a process people are trying to sometimes disguise as they go about it. So this is a copy that we're going to see another one of from the Library of the College of Physicians, but it's a beautiful Froben edition of Janus Cornarius's, who's a Lutheran Protestant German physician, humanist. He's interpreting Hippocrates's writings. Again, these are the works of Hippocrates. The only issue is Janus Cornarius's name at the top of them. And I don't know if you can see well from where you are, but I'd encourage you to look under the words Coy Liber at the top. You can see slight discoloration. And those are actually little slips of paper that are pasted over the name of Janus Cornarius. And it's done in a way that's like not detracting from the beauty of this book. And that's important. It's important because we need to understand that this bookseller, and we're going to see again a similar copy in a minute, that this bookseller or this owner didn't want to make their book look censored. They wanted to make their book look beautiful. This was an expensive commodity that they were trying to preserve at the same time that they expurgated it. And you can see people reflecting on that explicitly too. This is a copy of Otto Grunfels, who's an apostate monk, because he was Catholic, and then he converted to Lutheranism, like gave up his monastic orders, and then he's now a heretic. So his name gets crossed out. Or in this case, cut out from the middle of the page, right? You can see that hole under Novi Herbari Tomos Secundus. But we can put that alongside also archival records. For example, this request from this man from Siena, Ascanio Bulgarino, who wrote in that he was looking for a reading license for a book, but he didn't know the author's name. He wrote, here the name has been cut out and blank paper has been put there. And again, the blank paper is there because it supports the page, right? You're less likely to tear it. So the blank paper is put in to support the book, right? To save it at the same time that you're censoring it. It's this irony of preservation and destruction at the same time that fascinates me. Sometimes books that were expurgated were trying to hide that expurgation, and other times not. This copy of Leonhard Fuchs that's held at the New York Academy of Medicine has like a huge stub still, right? You can see very clearly the preliminary materials, the dedicatory letters to Protestant princes that have been ripped out. By contrast, this copy of Erastus's Disputations, a reader notes in a later hand that only the preface is missing here. And then you can see just the tiny, tiny stub in the gutter. Sometimes books were expurgated by tearing things out. Other times they were expurgated with pen, as we've seen and we'll see again. And still other times words were removed from the page, I would argue by scraping probably. So this is Konrad Gessner, Zwinglian, Swiss naturalist physician. We're looking at a later edition of his History of Animals, and his name is scraped off the page in the middle. Leonhard Fuchs, the Lutheran physician again, whose name is scraped off of the binding of this book. I would play this game with myself. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of copies of expurgated medical books. And one of the games that I played with myself is to try to decide based on my observations of the binding of the book when it came to me, whether I thought it would be expurgated on the inside or not. And so that led me to find all sorts of signs of expurgation on the outside of books as well, including that. Here's another version here where you can see a piece of the binding is cut off, Leon, and then that would have said Hart Fuchs. And then you can see De Medendis Morbis, the title shows up again. I'd also reflect on the sort of irony that comes with pasting over, that is putting blank paper over a prohibited author's name, which often seems to invite later writing, right? There's nothing like a blank space to encourage people to write their own things back in. So this is a much later, probably 18th or 19th century hand that has written Leonardus Fuchs's name back in on top of where it's been censored out. This is an example of where paper was pasted on top of the book, but instead of with paste, it was done with wax. So you can see sort of the materials that people had on hand that they were throwing at this process of expurgating books. And this is one of my favorite examples. So I was visiting this library, the Biblioteca Roberta Caracciolo in Lecce, which is in the boot of Italy. This is not a medical text. I confess, this is not a medical text, but it was such a beautiful example of, innovative and creative ways that people censored that I've really been drawn to it. So this is a copy of a book by Erasmus, again, who's prohibited. And in this case, the text has been censored not only by crossing it out. In fact, you can see the first word there is crossed out, but then somebody's measured out the text, the correct amount of paper, but not blank paper, printed paper, and ironically, printed paper from another edition of this same book and pasted it on upside down on top. It's obvious now that I'm drawing your attention to it here, but in this big book with many hundreds of pages, as you're flipping through, it doesn't look censored, and yet you're not at risk of accidentally reading the text. People are aware of the aesthetic choices that they're making when they expurgate books. And in fact, they say so. So this is a copy of an astronomical text that then has been whited out, right? Cerus has been put there. And we can see actually an example these are from the Inquisition records in Venice, where Bernardo Mazarin, who's an agent for the Giunti family, gets called in to testify about what they're doing about prohibited books, banned books that are being sold out of the shop. And he says, I've blotted it out with cerus, right? I've put white over it so as not to mar the volume. And if it pleases you, I will also glue a piece of paper over the letter. That is the offending dedicatory letter at the beginning. Not this exact copy of the book that it's referring to, but it's referring again to this practice or the mixed practices that went into the physical expurgation of books. You can see books, again, censored on the outside with pen as people cross the names off of books that would have been stacked differently than we think of books being put on shelves now, but stacked flat as opposed to upright. And we can see books censored with a pen. Those little tight loops are sort of classic signs of expurgation within the censor's office in particular, and then the big smears of ink with a brush. And we can see the ways that, censorship with a pen is so visible and arresting now and then, but it's meant to preserve, right? It is meant to cross out one part while maintaining the other page. If you were to rip out the whole page, that would destroy more of the book than if you blot out the offending text. One of the things that I've been interested in is how over time that iron gall ink, again, thinking about materiality, that iron gall ink that people were writing with, which is so different from the ink that was used for printing, has corroded pages. So sometimes I'd actually find records of censored books that are described as being burned. And it's not actually burned, it's burned through the reaction of the ink to the paper over hundreds of years. These are sort of unexpected collateral damage of expurgation centuries later. And then this is my favorite. So the first time I saw one of these, I was absolutely astonished. And this has really propelled a ton of my thinking about this subject. But this is a work by Conrad Gessner, his letter to readers at the front of his book on animals. And this is a copy that's held at Stanford. And instead of blacking out the name, again, this is a big, expensive, highly illustrated book that people want to keep looking nice. Instead of blacking out the name or pasting over it, this person has gone in and they've transformed the letters into just random other letters, such that I would argue that the name, instead of being a prohibited name, is turned into sort of a type ornament, just a part of the page without its meaning in the same way. And I thought that at first there was just one person who does this, but it turns out there's a bunch of people that do this kind of censorship. And I found them in a number of different collections and done in different ways. And these are held in different places around the world. And you might ask now, like, if we're looking at this kind of copy, does it say anything? And it doesn't. But I have one example where it does, where the person who's expurgating the book has taken the time to write something in the process of blacking out the letters. They've written something. So this is a copy that's held at the Biblioteca Universitaria in Padova, so in Padua near Venice. And it's a copy of Leonhard Fuchs's On the Fabric of the Human Body. So he's writing about anatomy. Again, this is not knowledge that is prohibited because of the medical content, but it's knowledge that's prohibited because the author was Lutheran. And so what has this guy written as he's gone through to censor his copy of the book? He's written Tutti di piango e poi la notte. Well, he's actually got the quote wrong. This is a Petrarch poem, but he's got tutti di il notte piango again. So crying, crying, weeping, all day I weep. And then at night, when miserable mortals take rest, I find that I am in tears and that my pains are doubled. Thus I spend my time weeping. And I was like, whoa, because as you can see, as this page is torn a little bit in the middle, this reader, who's probably a medical student or a physician himself, has gone in and censored his own copy of a medical book with references to weeping. Maybe it's just the song that's stuck in his head at the time, but it's not. I'm going to go into that in a minute. But then he's had to cover it up. What you don't see well here is that there was previously a piece of paper glued on top of that someone has removed. But you can see the signs of its removal there. So then later on in the book, at the beginning of another section, we can see the paper remaining, right? And I desperately wanted to know what was written under that. And so the librarians helped me shine a very bright light at it. And what's written underneath it is a little bit more reflection from literary sources. Quantunque il simular sia le più volte. So this is a quote from Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. Although deceit is mostly disapproved, seeming to show a mind malevolent, many a time it brings, as has been proved, advantages that are self-evident, and mortal threats and dangers has removed. So we're thinking here about when it is appropriate to dissimulate, that is to do one thing, to say or do one thing while believing another. And so I want to argue, based on these examples, that this is an opportunity to see a medical reader reflecting on the pain, perhaps the sadness, the frustration of having to expurgate books, that at the same time that he's doing this process, he's reflecting on dissimulation, he's reflecting on weeping, and that's done in a private way, right? He's written these and then covered them back up. And this is, I think, a really fascinating opportunity to think about how people responded to censorship through an investigation of a physical object. Because at its core, I want to question for us, like, this is a copy of Leonhard Fuchs's Opera Omnia from the early 17th century. It's a huge book. I don't even have space on my screen to show you how big. It's a really big book. And the name Leonhard Fuchs is in like big letters. As you can see, it's just got the tiniest little cross through it. So what does that do? And I want us to think really seriously about what this symbolic act of expurgation does. And the word for that at the time, the conception that people had for this at the time was damnatio memoriae. That is the damnation of memory. And this is important because this isn't about forgetting, right? You can see damnatio memoriae here in the margin. This isn't about forgetting who wrote these books. It's not about forgetting Protestants. It's not about forgetting religious controversy. What's going on here is, I would argue, an inscription of religious controversy fundamentally into texts that aren't even about religion. That is, that instead of it being about forgetting the controversial context, it's about reminding readers over and over again with every page where they see the author's name at the top that there's something dangerous, potentially problematic about the text that they are reading, and that fundamentally inscribes the context of reading. I would argue that this is insidious. And this is an example here, the copy here, held at the Biblioteca Romolo Spezioli in Fermo in Italy, has the blacked out copy of Leonhard Fuchs's name, right, on the right-hand side. That's that big blacked out section that also burned through a bit. But it also has the reading license right next to it. And the reading license says in very clear terms that this person is allowed to keep this book, but that every time they see the name of Leonhard Fuchs or others like him, that they will expurgate that name out. Again, inscribed in the license is the name that they are to expurgate. This is not about forgetting. This is about inscribing in the book this context of punishment, of danger, and then changing the interpretive scope around it, I would argue. But it doesn't make these books disappear. It makes them end up expurgated back on the shelves of major libraries. This is the Biblioteca Corsiniana. It's an 18th century papal library in Rome. And you can see here the shelves of heterodox books. And I'm going to turn things over in a moment to the collections at the College of Physicians in Philadelphia, because one of the things that I think is important is that we begin to understand and look into our collections of medical books from the 16th and the 17th centuries in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, and to understand these objects as having histories that come out of contexts of censorship, and to be able to describe those more carefully and to understand the ways that it changed readers and the practice of reading. So with that, Ty, I'm going to turn things over to you and let you talk a little bit about this book, and then I'll add any comments I have. Sound good?
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Ty Marks, and I am the Special Collections and Rare Books Librarian at the College of Physicians. One of my colleagues in the library assisted Hannah and I in locating these examples of expurgation that we're going to talk to you about today. So the first item that we're going to look at here is Catalogus. And as Hannah stated earlier, and as well as throughout her work Forbidden Knowledge, Protestants were large targets for Catholic censorship, and one such person was Otto Brunsfeld, a German-born Carthusian monk who turned Protestant convert, specifically to Lutheranism. In chapter 1 of her book, she tells us that his name appeared in a 1550 list of the most important heretics, and he took up the study of medicine and plants only later in his life, obtaining his degree in medicine in Basel in 1532. So the college has a 1530 copy of Brunfeld's work, Catalogus Illustrium Medicorum, a catalog of famous doctors and medical writers. It was published in Aggenorati, the Latinized name for Strasbourg, by Ionem Schotu, which is the Latinized version of Joannem Schotum. And in his article on Brunfels in the journal Botanische Zeitung, the archivist F.W.E. Roth notes that Catalogus Illustrium Medicorum was completed in 1529 and focuses on the lives and writings of primarily ancient Greek doctors. That is significant here because the top half of the page that's on the left side of your screen is ripped off, and the people who were ripped off of, who were in that section in woodcut, were people who were predominant in ancient Greek history of medicine, and also in mythology. So it originally included the names and images of Pelops, Oribasius, Soranus, and Machaon. Pelops was the Greek mythological figure in the story The Cutting of Pelops, which is said to be the earliest writing to depict soldier surgery and soldier prosthesis. Oribasius was a physician and medical writer in a region that was once part of Greece but is now part of Turkey. And because his work included information he gathered during his studies at the Library of Alexandria, he is credited for saving information that would have otherwise been lost. Soranus was a Greek physician who contributed to the field of what we now refer to as obstetrics and gynecology, and he created the precursor to the APGAR score, which is a quick way to assess a newborn's health after birth. And Machaon was what we would now call a trauma surgeon in ancient Greece. It's not entirely clear to me if this page was ripped on with that intent in mind, but if it was, it's very telling that those figures were removed. We also see that the Latinized version of the author's name has been crossed out. You can kind of make it out if you look very closely, but it's one of those instances of expurgation where they're really trying to get the name out of there. So on the image in the top right, we have Errata, which was written by Leonard Fuchs. This was an interesting find because it was bound with another item that we have. This copy holds this item bound in the same book as Catalogus by the author we just discussed. You can see that Fuchs' name is completely censored out on that page, which is also very interesting. We'll have to investigate further if there are any more examples of expurgation in that part of the text, but it kind of exceeded the scope of what we were doing here. And very lightly in pencil below the word autore, you can see that someone has lightly penciled in Leonhard Fuchs name back in. In the page at the bottom, going back to the main text of Catalogus, you can see it looks like there may have been a page removed. However, when comparing these pages and page counts with other books that I had available, I could not see what could have possibly been here. So either it's just a weird quirk of printing, or,
Interesting.
multiple copies had that ripped out.
So maybe a binding page too. I think I've got another one of these for you as well.
Okay, Hippocrates. I think digging into this book was one of my favorite parts of post-reading Forbidden Knowledge, because now we're talking about Janus Cornerius. I won't go into too much detail about him here because the amount of detail that Hannah puts in her book about him, I could not do it justice, but it is a wild ride. So
he's feuding with Leonhard Fuchs. So the heart of it is that he and Leonhard Fuchs hate each other. So just because people are Lutheran doesn't mean they get along. They hate each other. They write all these nasty books about each other, and then other people censor them. So
lots of drama, but it was very, very fascinating to learn about him. So in the book, Hannah discusses the practice of censoring names of translators as well as editors of work. And one example is Cornarius's translation of Poemedicorum. So Cornarius was a German physician who published original works and dedicated a significant portion of his work to translating Greek texts. His story in relation to medical texts is very interesting. As we've said before, the college has a 1546 translation of Hippocrates opera, or the extant works of Hippocrates, and it was printed in Lugudni, the Latinized name for Lyons. On the title page, Ianum Cornarium, which is the Latinization of Cornarius's already Latinized name, that has been expurgated, and it does look like there's some pasting on it. Oh, there's pasting on the image on the right, but on the left, it's kind of been scratched out a little bit, and you can see a hole through the paper. On the image on the right, this was really interesting because about 8 pages or 4 individual leaves of paper have been removed. As Hannah said earlier, Catholic censorship at times removed introductory letters from text in an effort to remove Lutheranism from humanist physician practices. So the section removed from here had epistola on the top of the recto, or the left side of the page, and nuncupatoria on the verso, or the top of the right hand of the page. And only the final page of that introductory letter is intact. I figured this out because the Library of Congress and a few other places had some versions of this available digitally.
I love looking through digitized copies online. I mean, if you go through a bunch of the prohibited authors that I talk about in my book and you search them on Google Books and limit yourself to the 16th century, you're going to find like hundreds of copies of expurgated books that are just digitized on Google Books. They're out there. They are like hiding in plain sight. And I think that one of the things that I've hoped my book does is encourage libraries to look closely at their collections to see what they might have. So
yeah, I think
Ty, thanks for doing that.
this would be a very cool project. I know we've come across some expurgated books in passing, but especially after reading your book, looking deeper into the history of how a lot of these people were connected and which parts of history they were in. Now you're moving into not just the history of the book based on the contents of the book, but the history of the book in printing and the history of the book as an object. So this would be a really cool project to undertake someday.
I've got one last one, your copy of Fuchs. Do you want to say anything more about it, or
Oh, yes.
can I? Good, okay.
So, as we've said, as Hannah has said, there was significant focus on censoring the work of Leonhard Fuchs, the Lutheran physician, botanist, and professor from Germany. In chapter 1, Hannah discusses the Pauline Index and some of the amendments that were made regarding some of the books on that list. Regarding Fuchs' work, she notes that the amendment regarding his botanical stipulates that his name had to be removed from the works for them to be usable, and if his name was not removed, the works would be considered prohibited. This is seen in our copy of De Historia. The basic translation of this title is Notable Commentaries on the History of Plants. In English, it's often referred to as The Great Herbal of Leonhard Fuchs. This edition was published in Lugudny, again, the Latinized version of Lyons, by Balthasarum Arnoletum in 1549, and that is the Latinized version of the name Balthasar Arnolet. On this title page, what may have been Leonhardo Fuccio, which is one of the iterations you'll see of Fuchs' name, that has been crossed out, along with the word medicus, which means doctor. It is unclear, but these marks could have been washed out or faded with time. Hannah and I had discussed this before, and I'm definitely going to have to investigate that with a bright light to see if there's anything missing there at the top of the page. But also at the bottom of the page, it looks like there was text that also may have been washed out.
Mhm.
And possibly the printer's name was crossed out at some point and then washed out as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I love this copy. I'm so delighted that you found it. I think that one of the things that this allows us to see is that books that were censored were considered to be dirty later too on the book market. And so there's this attempt to try to wash that away. And one of the ways that I found censored books in library records on a startlingly regular basis was under the description water damage, which is, it's a different kind of damage from ink damage, but it's because people were trying to remove these marks of censorship in books. I mean, to be clear, when I was working in the Vatican Library, the censored books remain censored throughout. There's no attempt to clean up those books. So it's about how they circulated in the long aftermath of censorship. And I have a $5 bet with Ty about this inscription at the bottom, which I am convinced will say that it's granted. I think this is a reading license, and it'll say the Inquisitor of some place in probably Italy has granted permission to read this book to the name of a person. And I don't know if there's a bright enough light in the world, but that's my expertise. That's what I think we're seeing. And additionally, it's worth pointing out that the last image here is from the same book, but a different part of it. So we divide books into chapters. They divided books into chapters and books. And at the beginning of a new book within a book, they would put a new title page, which would say the author's name again. And so like, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing these repeated acts of censorship throughout the book, not just on like the initial title page, but repeatedly after that as well.
So this copy is also interesting because a page from the index has been removed towards the end of the book. I didn't have access to another copy where I could confirm, but there was one of those like very clean cut pieces of pages, nothing that could be confused with an interesting quirk of binding. I can only tell you that it was an index. So we also have on the top right, you can see Leonhartus Fuchsius Medicus, another iteration of his name, has also been expurgated. They also want to erase that he is a doctor. And then in the bottom, it's erasing his name, but also medico autore, saying he's not even an author.
Right. And I think that's an important point to bring up. That is that it's about expurgating the name of the author, but also any praise of Protestant authors was removed. And so these kinds of signs of authority are removed along with his name.
Yes. And I remember reading in your book that you had said that the church also would often remove words that we would find kind of benign today. They would remove them because back then, with its etymology and the way that people widely used it, those words were specifically connected to religion and how religious spaces or people were viewed. So I thought that that was very interesting. Another really cool thing about this book is that we have a facsimile of it up in the Illustrating Medicine exhibit that we have open on weekends. So if you want to see it, it's a 2-part text. The exhibit is open from 10 to 5 on weekends if you want to take a look.
Wonderful. Thank you. With that, I think we can move to question and answer for the remainder of the period. Donna, do you want to?
Yeah, I
Great.
don't mind hopping in and maybe I can read some to y'all. Thank you so
Sure.
much. That was amazing. Let's see what we got.
I see some of them here too. Do you want?
Yeah.
I am fluent in Italian. So that's
Yeah.
an early question. I'm fluent in Italian. I work in Latin. I work in German. I work in Spanish. I work in French, work in lots of languages. That's been a big part of the training, and it's a big part of historians training in general. So
Yeah.
absolutely. And then it's also in handwriting, right? So that's honestly my superpower as a scholar, is that I'm really good at reading handwriting. Oh,
That is
can
amazing because reading old languages in the handwriting that they used back then is very difficult.
Yeah.
Can I show you?
I remember what during quarantine I was helping transcribe a lot of the medical texts in the library for y'all. And I remember also just struggling with like, yeah, doctor's handwriting and just the cursive and all the like niche things. So more power to you.
Can I add a few more answers in here? One of the weirdest things that I found, Mark, on page 30 of my book is like one of my favorite finds reproduced, which is that as these physicians are feuding, I found this copy where this guy writes in the margin. He usually, all of his annotations in the margins are in Latin, except for this one where he slips into Italian and he's like, "You're an asshole." He shouts out in the margins of this book at this author that he doesn't like. And I love these moments where we realize that, like, people are people throughout long histories, and they come alive in books when you take the time to really look carefully at them.
No, it's such an intimate experience, but it's yeah, kind of like getting even a book at like a used bookstore and like seeing someone who annotated and like wrote their comments. I kind of love that. So yeah, I there's this one question I really was interested in. Like with a lot of these texts, do you think a lot of these attempts to ban some of these books had an opposite effect? Like people were even more interested in them, like seeing what the naughty things are that are left out.
Yeah, so that's a really, an interesting point and an important point too. So I'm going to answer it from a few different ways. One, there's like the voyeuristic approach that people were like, "Ooh, here's my shopping list," right? And there are certainly accounts of that, but also it's hard to get and hard to find, or it can be hard to find prohibited books in Italy at different times. What I think is really interesting are when the indexes of expurgated books, that is like the books that Catholics have like invested all of this time and energy in correcting, when those come out, the librarian at the Bodleian in the 17th century is like, we got to get a copy of that and make sure we have all those books. They're like, these are books that are considered to be so important that even though they're prohibited, they're going to make sure that they're available in Catholic Italy. We need to make sure that they're in our library at Oxford too. So that's like a different kind of endorsement of these texts that I think is important.
Oh yeah, and you'll see it a lot across different medical historical libraries where you'll just randomly run across different printings of people saying, here's a giant bibliography of all the most important books pertaining to medical history or pertaining to the current field of medicine at that time. And most of the books on those lists have been banned in Italy.
Wow.
Can I answer the
Yeah,
question
please
down at the
hop in.
bottom from David about he writes, I'm fascinated that it's the authors themselves that are expurgated, but the texts are intact. If I've understood, this is based on Protestantism of the authors. Yes, you've understood. That's right. And then how were books by non-Christians treated? And that's a really interesting and complicated question. Maimonides, Jewish physician, Ibn Sina or Avicenna, as his name is Latinized, Muslim physician, medieval physician. Well, Avicenna is an absolutely essential part of the medical canon. And it's important to realize that, the index of prohibited books, and this is, I think, one of the things that my research really underlines, that the Catholic indexes of prohibited books in the 16th and 17th centuries are about fighting Protestantism. That's heresy. Jews are not heretics. They're not Christian heretics, they're Jews. And there's a distinction there for Catholics. I mean, even within the space of the Inquisition, Jews aren't put on trial for being Jews. They're put on trial for having been forcibly converted and then continuing to practice their faith after conversion in 16th century Spain, for example. So one of the cases that's quite interesting of a Jewish physician in the 16th century in Italy is Modus Lusitanus. So he's a Portuguese physician who escapes Portugal and comes to Italy and lives there for a while, and then moves to Thessaloniki in Greece, where he lives openly as a Jew again. He writes these really important medical books, these books where they go through and talk about, different cases that come up. And interestingly, it's mostly not about him being maybe a crypto Jew. That's the problem. It's about the kinds of things that he talks about. And the kinds of things that he talks about are things that would have been fine 100 years earlier, and that are only suddenly a problem in the wake of the Reformation. So for example, a case of a nun who gets pregnant, maybe from being in a bathtub, like if she's in a bathtub and she gets pregnant, and Coronarius is like, that doesn't work like that. It wasn't the bathtub, right? Like that's not how that happens. She's had sex and that's how, but then that becomes an episode. Catholics read that in the 16th century as an episode of mocking the clergy, right? And so that becomes something that needs to be removed from the text. So it's less about, again, what Lusitanus is saying from a medical capacity, or even in this case, what he's saying as a crypto Jew, and instead about the ways that he's talking about the behaviors of the clergy in a time when that's not funny anymore.
No, that's an important distinction. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of questions also coming up, why go through all this trouble, right? Why not simply ban or destroy the entire book? Yeah, you're keeping a lot of these things still intact. It is very interesting, the various physical ways you outline through which these physical objects, are cut out or pasted over or crossed out or white out. I feel like it's something I guess I haven't always thought of too. Why go through all that trouble?
It's super interesting that in a time where there are ginormous fights and movements because someone practices a different type of Christianity than another person, but they were more concerned with the field of medicine being able to progress despite these issues. So there had to be some kind of argument or conversation on how can we continue to take care of people, but also uphold to these different religious laws that, were to be upheld, versus today, where the focus tends to be on the entire content of something, even if the person challenging or wanting to ban that book has not read it or has only read sections of it. So that's one of the big differences. Also, you had some papal experts in conversation with people actually practicing and studying these things. And that kind of also helped steer towards, okay, we understand that this text as a whole is very useful, and that if you know, doctors don't have access to this, if students don't have access to this, there could be some very major consequences. So that's like one of the reasons you would just do a section of what you disagree with rather than taking away the whole thing, because the damage that could be done by taking away the entire book or entire series of books of works would have been way too severe.
Is there any other questions you guys want to hop in? I don't know.
There's
Hannah?
an interesting question about why some of the books have words that narrow to a point at the bottom.
Oh yeah. Can you speak to that?
With that, you're getting into the history of printing, and you know, there's different types of what we now call fonts. So some of it was stylistic, depending on which century of printing that you're in. Some of it had to do with the location that you were in. So the way that words were printed in Germany may not have looked the same as the way that they were printed in Rome. So kind of stylistic. Also, a lot of these fonts mimicked how people wrote. So when you're talking about the history of printing press, a lot of early books were copied by hand, often by people that were clergy, monks or nuns. And then once the printing press, and we're only talking about Western printing press here, a lot of the casts that were made for printing were based off of those very clear, distinct handwritings that you would see in hand copied books. And then it kind of evolved over time, depending on where you were. So a bit of stylization, and then you also get into some artistic choices when you get into like illuminations of letters, where you incorporate more artwork into some of the letters you see on the pages.
Yeah, if anyone here is local, and you have a chance to check out our library, just seeing a lot of those books in person is just so crazy. A lot of like even the colors and yeah, everything that goes into like the stylization of things. It's really beautiful.
Oh, someone's commenting on the word crypto Jew. So crypto
Yeah, can I?
Jews, historically were Jews in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain who were forced to convert, and then they had to hide their practice.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Not crypto like currency. Really important. Thank you. Yeah, people who were forced to convert to Christianity. There's the expulsion of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. And then Jews are forced to either leave or convert to Christianity. And the Jews who decided to stay and continue practicing as Jews, despite the fact that they'd been converted to Christianity, are referred to as crypto Jews in the literature. I didn't even understand that. Thank you.
So also what you'll see with that too, in some Christian Catholic families, you know, people will hear stories of, you know, there was this time of the week where we would all go down into the basement, or we would all go into this dark room. We would close all the doors, close all the blinds, and light candles, and I don't know why. That's kind of a leftover remnant of how crypto Jews had to live. There are also stories of how some crypto Jews would take bread that was soaked in like pig fat, and they would burn that over the fire because they wanted to make it seem as if they were the average Spanish citizen. They weren't eating the pork, but it was a way to kind of survive. So if you're interested in researching that more, there is a lot of literature out on that, on crypto Jews, on conversos. The Center for Jewish History is actually a really great resource if you're looking into that as well.
Oh, thank you guys. I guess one more question I have, if we can, you know, try to like wrap it up and think about this too. I always want to like go back and, you know, it's Banned Books Week. We've been talking about a lot of these books, you know, that are older, right? But how do we like think about this sort of censorship, like maybe today, and like how do we still see a lot of like us as a humanity grappling with a lot of these like same things still?
Like with a lot of things, a larger group of people have to be open to conversation about these things. What a lot of libraries will do if a book is challenged is that the person challenging the book has to read it, the librarians have to read it, the board have to read it, and you know, there's a discussion about why that item should be or should not be removed from shelves. The process is a little different depending on what state you're in or, what township you're in. It can vary, but that's generally how it goes. But there just has to be a wider conversation about what makes people uncomfortable and what they can do in their own lives when navigating public spaces that have books that differ from their own beliefs.
I'd like to point out that I want to draw attention to the range of practices that make up censorship. That's one of the things that I hope I've pointed to today, and also the range of reasons that have motivated censorship in different times and places. And I think it's worth interrogating those carefully. Doing so, I do that as a historian primarily in relation to materials from the distant past, but I think that that same set of questions can be applied to the present, and I would encourage all of us to do so.
No, for sure, for sure. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Ty, for, talking about a lot of these books. And just as a reminder, yeah, our library is now open on weekends. We have a new exhibition up that is illustrating medicine, so definitely go check that out. And if you're interested in more virtual programming on library stuff, we have our historical happy hour, and that one will be looking at books in our collection on medical astrology. So get your birth charts ready. We'll be talking about that. Thank you guys so much, and everyone have a good night.